Good evening and welcome back. We're so excited for this last and final night. It's hard to believe that it's already been 4 nights of this 12 questions program. It feels like it's gone by very fast in a lot of ways, but we're so grateful that you're tuning in at this time. If you're live with us right now and if you're with our audience here, we're so grateful that you're here with us. But if you're watching this after the fact, let us know where you're watching from, how many are there with you, where you're coming from. If it's a church or the rest, we'd love to know that and be able to follow up with you. My name is Brandon Edwards, and I'm the campus minister here at The Ohio State University with Buckeyes for Christ. I'm also the college minister at the Church of Christ on Fishinger Road, just right up the road here on campus. We're so grateful to be able to have this opportunity to do this 12 questions together. Tonight is going to be a fantastic night. We have a wonderful scholar and apologist who has come all the way from California to spend time with us to answer 3, candidly, quite tough questions. In fact, when I first started looking at the questions, they started coming in. I wasn't surprised that these questions arrived, but more than that, I knew exactly who needed to spend some time answering them. So I'm excited to be able to introduce to you tonight Jovan Paez. He is a scholar and apologist and is a preacher all the way from California. He and I have been friends for close to 20 years. I'm grateful for his scholarship and for the way he's prepared for these questions. And tonight he kicks off with Marxism and critical race theory. Can a Christian believe in such things? Don't want to take up any more of his time, so with that in mind, I'll turn it over to Jovan. Jovan?
Thank you everyone for being here, and I appreciate so much this opportunity to tackle what is definitely one of the I think one of the most difficult and challenging questions that we have to address. One of the things that I really started thinking about regarding this question about Marxism and critical race theory is how to bridge these two ideas together, because it may not seem like they are quite related, but they are, and they really have framed a lot of the questions that we're dealing with in society right now, whether or not we are aware of that or not. And so as we look at a few things, I want to introduce you to this topic. And so that's really what I'm going to do tonight is first I want to kind of give you a background. I always find it's helpful to appreciate the sort of the person credited with the philosophy and kind of why or what his motives were behind looking at his philosophy, and then how it's impacted us, and even some of the things that we need to be mindful of. So we're going to do some of that, and then look at critical race theory. So the scholar Thomas Sowell, he said that what Marx had done was essentially offer us a philosophy and a economic theory. And in doing that, what he's saying is the influence of Karl Marx has impacted how we evaluate life, how we look at society. We have a certain perspective. That's why you might hear about Marxism and even some of its other brainchilds like socialism and communism. And you will see how that people who come with this sort of Marxist slant bring a certain philosophy to how they look at life, how they look at resources, and how that impacts. And of course, in economic theory, we're going to look at that in just a moment, but and it also branch out in a few other areas. The other thing is, what he has done is also impacted sociology, psychology, social psychology. He has essentially put his thumbprint on some of the most important sciences that we lean on today, outside of the hard sciences that we might think of, like in the physical science world. Though born in Germany, he was really educated in England, and really is where he spent a lot of his time researching how society works, researching how the conflicts and how change occurs. And when he began to do this study, he really was trying to understand from a capitalistic point of view how society changes. And what he learned was that there is this conflict, that social change seemingly only occurs with conflict. And when those who are at the bottom of the societal totem pole, like the workers, those who don't have a lot of wealth, in fact, they're the laborers, you might call them, he called them the proletariat. I call them, what a lot of people call them, the have-nots. But also, he saw at the top of the totem were the bourgeoisies, those that were the owners. They owned the land, they owned the material wealth, they owned the factories. They're the wealthy. And so you get this, he saw this dichotomy between the wealthy and the laborers. And social change then only happened through social revolution. And usually among the younger people who had seen their parents grow up in poverty, their grandparents grow up in poverty, and now they have the energy sort of to take over or move forward and correct this. So as we look at the next slide, and this brings up the issue of social revolution. And essentially this would have been through conflict and real conflict. So there would have been physical takeover of property, physical takeover of wealth, physical takeover of bureaucratic positions. And so those that did not have become the new holders of society's wealth. And the way they did that through social revolution and social change ultimately was, painful, socially painful. And a couple examples would have been how the old Russia moved from a capitalist economy and then became a socialistic or communistic party in the footsteps of Marxist ideology. So now the proletariat become the owners, and what their goal is to then create, ideally, right, in the ideal, a sort of utopia, where now that we have collected the wealth, and now that we've taken out those in power, those who've owned everything, we can now share the wealth. We can now have equality. We can have equity. And though you might work, you will then still have some sort of share in it, but it'll be based on your needs, not so much giving you any allowance to exceed, perhaps, and explore that. So this utopia that Marx was hoping to create, because one of the things that Marx was worried about is you have to appreciate that there was a lot of philosophical talk at this time about what is man, how does society know things, how do we know things. You had Immanuel Kant, you had a series of others who were sort of developing sort of the early stages of sociology, and this is why Karl Marx comes in and becomes a major figurehead in the sociological realm, because he was not only concerned with how things worked in a capitalistic early industrial age, when we're moving away from farmlands and going into production and manufacturing. He was also concerned with how to change, how to make social change. And so in the end, without going into all the history of Marx, which we don't have time for, that would be a very long discussion, it ultimately amounts to, he believed in some form of communism. Dr. Sewell would call that lower C communism, the idea of being together and working together for the common good, versus capital C communism as the kind of the political party and kind of social agenda that we might be aware of today. But even with that distinction, he is highly influential in what is communism and even socialism today. But this creates some interesting questions. And one of them that I, as a Christian, began really thinking about, and I've been thinking about this for quite some time, is that this idea of caring for each other by itself is not a bad idea. This idea of making sure that everyone has their needs and no one above is taking advantage of people of lower means and lower resources, on paper it sounds really good. And I think we can all agree, on paper, we like that agenda. The problem, of course, comes down to how those who are oppressed take by force the very resources available and then try to create from that chaos of blood a utopia. It hasn't really worked out in societies that have tried this very hard kind of Marxism. But for some Christians, it seems very interesting and appealing, because if you read passages like Acts chapter 2, verse 42 to 47, sounds a lot like the early Jesus movement. Listen to this. I'm going to back up to verse 42. And they've devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And all came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together, had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. Now, doesn't that sound similar? In ideal, right? The early Christians were so concerned for each other, they shared their wealth. They sold their things, and they took care of each other. Now, I read this passage, and at times I'm going, man, I wish we did more of this. I think it would be healthy for us in a number of ways, and I think especially in a land where we often have way too much, we might sell some things and not even notice it, right? Still, I want to make some evaluations here. I want to mark some distinctions. We need to be careful here, because I've read Christian writings and Christian scholars, and I've had conversations with church members and people in general that Jesus was a socialist, that Jesus was a communist, that he may not have said it, but that's exactly what his followers did. And passages like Acts 2 come up, Acts chapter 5 and 6, where we read about the church helping the widows and even some people selling their properties and helping people. We see a lot of that. Seem to be, maybe that's what's going on, and maybe we're missing something because we're caught up in being American. Well, I always have to keep the option open, but as I evaluated, this is what I've come to realize. We need to be careful in applying modern ideas into ancient texts. And the reason why is that we fall into the danger of anachronisms. We fall in the danger of using ideas that are out of sequence with ancient times. We pour in modern ideas into the past, and that's really quite not fair, because now we're doing a disservice to what this text is telling us about the ancient church. So that's one thing I'm concerned about by doing that. The second thing is we need to be mindful of not confusing community with communism. You might say, well, that seems like a distinction without really one, right? But no, it really is different. You can be a community without the ideals of everyone has to share equally into everything. So you got to remember, communism is about equal participation in the material resources of the community. But being community does not require an equal distribution of the material wealth of a people. There's a distinction that's very important. You could be community without having to give up your resources so that there's equity. I need to be careful with this. The other thing we need to be mindful of, we cannot confuse similarity with compatibility. Just because there's similar traits in systems doesn't mean they're all the same, not even built on the same values and ideas. Communism is built on a very different idea. Marxism is built on a very different notion. It's built on the distribution of wealth. It's built on the distribution of equity, social equality, by taking from the material wealth and doing it forcibly, and then structuring society based on that. This is a very different approach, a very different value in the New Testament church. The other thing is, we see in the New Testament a lot of instruction, and I've cited a few, of that it's important for Christians to have a work ethic, work honestly with their hands, and also do so that they themselves are not a burden to their community, the church. And on top of that, Paul would instruct certain Christians that were sort of being idle, going from house to house and sort of leaning on other people, as they had this misguided notion that Jesus was coming soon so they wouldn't have to work. And Paul says, no, if a man will not work, neither let him eat. That's some strong language. And showing that there may be similarity of concern, but the value system attached to it make them very incompatible. And finally, yes, there was mutual care. One of my favorite passages in 2 Corinthians is when Paul describes a number of churches. He describes the churches in Macedonia. He describes churches in Corinth that he's writing to. And they're describing, and he's talking about this gathering of resources for needy Christians in Jerusalem. And one of the things he says, he lifts up the poor Macedonian Christians, and he says they gave beyond their ability. They put themselves into further dire straits when they were poor. They still gave. But then Paul moves on in order to encourage the Corinthians. He moves on and says to them, and you need to take a lesson from them because you made a commitment to these needy Christians in Jerusalem, and now fulfill your pledge and give also to the needy saints in Jerusalem, that there be fairness, that your prosperity may go to them and bless them, and that so that maybe later their prosperity will bless you later, that there be fairness. In other words, it wasn't about equal distribution of wealth. It was about learning that those who may have more wealth can be like those who are without wealth and know the importance of sharing, being community, but it wasn't forced on them. It wasn't the wealthy need to stop being wealthy. It was that they needed to share and use their material blessings. Now, why is this so important? Well, we're going to get to how Marxism and even critical race theory come together. Now, let me back up again. Now, one of the things about Marxism is that it's really based on the empiricism of its time. Let me explain what I mean by that, if you're not familiar with that word. Empiricism is a way of looking at the world from purely natural means. It is like it's like the way you learned science as a kid. Remember? Things that you hear, things that you see, things that you touch, things that you hear, like the five senses, even though I didn't list all of them. That's a little game for you later. But when you think about empiricism essentially says if none of the five senses can detect it, it's not real. So empiricism was put on these studies of society and morality, and essentially you began to observe human behavior based on purely external phenomenon. Being wealthy was comfortable, being poor was uncomfortable. As an example, being overworked was hard, and being, again, wealthy, guess what? You became more wealthy, and maybe it looked toxic. It was all about physical observations. And that is the lens by which Marx looked at society. That is the lens by most of the people of his time looked at society, on purely material means, because that was the empiricism of his day. It was strictly natural, which means the idea of anything supernatural, God, was gone off the table, and anything immaterial like morality, what is an essence? In other words, what kind of thing is a human? Well, if it's transcendent, it is not empirical and it's not natural, so that's off the table as well. So you look at the world exclusively on naturalistic terms. Therefore, when Marx looked at society in these capitalistic frameworks, he didn't see, these people are hurting and it's bad for humans because of who they are and the dignity they have inherently. He saw them as those below who are struggling observably, and those above who are taking advantage observably. So he tied this empirical outcome and status to how he looked at the world and how he presented his view. Now, this way of looking at the world is important for us because it's tied to something a bit deeper that stems back to a debate There really wasn't a debate in human history up until the 13th century by William Occam, the famous Occam of Occam's razor. And he was one of the most influential figures that has impacted ethics ever since, even though he's not normally brought up. And I started searching through ethical books, even one that was just published last year out of Oxford University Press. They don't even bring up this idea of nominalism, which I'm about to introduce to you, but it's very significant. Essentially, with nominalism, what you have is, the word itself just simply means what something is named by. We're just dealing with names. We're dealing with ideas. We're just putting a name on something. So justice, for example, or dignity, is just something we've named an experience, but it doesn't exist apart from our living experience. So, where you might say we have human dignity, on nominalism it says, well, you might, but even if you had dignity, you have a different dignity than he has a different dignity. You do not share the quality of dignity. It is numerically different, or we might say the weight of our dignity is different per person, or to use the philosophical language, each person's dignity is a particular instance of dignity. And that becomes a problem. Because now we do not have an equality, we have already a shift in equality of essence. That's why, if there's no essences, all of our beliefs about value are constructs. They're just what we've built up socially. And in Marxism, the disparity between the wealthy and the workers were the lens by which he saw, and understood sort of what's going on and what needs to be changed and how to change it. But doing this created sort of an impetus in social theorists, and thus you get two other things. You get social conflict theory, which he's credited for. Had to study a bunch of that in my sociology classes. And critical theory, especially developed by the Frankfurt School. And critical theory then gave birth to critical race theory. And not just critical race theory, but a number of other types of critical theory, whether it's critical queer theory, whether it's critical, anyways, you can figure it out. There's several different kinds, especially intersectionality. That sort of is a tool, a lens, and we'll get to that a little bit now and in my other talk, but ultimately, Marxism, nominalism, and critical race theory, and social conflict theory, which are all together wrapped into the same sort of package. And if your brain is breaking, I understand, because it's a lot to take in, but they're all fundamentally brought down to the same thing. It is a framework at looking at society as a whole, not based on human essence and their quality that transcends just their physicalness, their value, their essence, their virtue, so to speak, is particular. And that's essential here, because that's exactly what critical race theory does. It makes everyone particular. It makes everyone, with the lens of intersectionality, which is designed to look at individuals in society who are experiencing a kind of inequality, experiencing a type of, disparity. They're going through some kind of oppression based on particular cross-sections, their race, their gender identity, their income, all kinds of ways to sort of bring it all down to one piece. And bit by bit, people's values are based on that, not on what a human is. And that becomes a problem. The fundamental problem about Marxism and critical race theory and the critical theory that it's based on is that it reduces people made in the image of God into their physical, social, and political kind of totem level, where they fit in society, whether they're rejected or not, whether they're part of the oppressive structure or not, and whether they're part of the oppressive structure or not, not because they're made in the image of God and they have inherent, transcendent, shareable human dignity. Their dignity is anchored elsewhere. And I think because of that, Christians should have a problem with critical race theory and Marxism, because it starts off in the wrong direction. It denies God, it denies transcendent nature, and emphasizes purely empiricism, naturalism, as to how to determine your value in society. Let me put it this way as we close, and I'll read this passage in Acts 17 as we close too. Martin Luther King's movement that he led, was based on a social structure of injustice against African Americans. I think we can all agree to that. But his ultimate reasoning was because these are human beings who have human dignity, and that human dignity is being denied. Today, the argument would be not that it's their human dignity, it's that they're African American. It's that they're part of an oppressive system. It's not about their inherent transcendent value. It's about their sociological position. And that takes you in two different directions. Acts 17, 24, 28 brings my point down. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. As Christians, as believers in God, we're all made in his image, and that's where our value lies. Does rejection of critical race theory mean that we should be blind to racism and oppression? No. But if we go that direction, we will be blinded by strictly empirical, naturalistic frameworks, which we're not designed to live by. Thank you.
Thanks, Jovan. Come on over. Let's have a seat. So, open and honest, you and I have been discussing this for years.
Yes. Yeah.
Quite a few years, not only because we've been friends for years, but because you actually helped me during my time in grad school, where I spent 3 years, in essence, working through critical theory as the framework. Critical race theory is the framework for which most of my graduate studies was done. And in fact, my master's thesis was on critical race theory and Christianity evangelicalism. And it's such a powerful subject to have to deal with, especially since it's so complex.
Yes.
It is not something as simple. In fact, one of the things that's often that we found when you go into academia and you start looking at these different areas, there are very few people who even agree on what the actual definition of critical race theory is, or even Marxism. It seems to be something that we just kind of toss out, or we use it as a catch-all term.
Right.
And don't miss it. We do this on the right and on the left politically. We throw these words out there as if we all are talking about the same thing. How important is it for us to know the definitions of these things, to actually spend time and understand them, especially since it's become such a key framework for so many arguments and so many debates in our culture today?
Yeah, a problem well-defined is half the battle. And we have to appreciate the world we're in, and how we are living in a shift. And the problem is, we, as you mentioned, have not taken the time to pay attention to the shift, and the shift in vocabulary.
Yeah.
And the shift on what are we talking about? Because on the surface, someone says, hey, you're saying you're okay with oppression?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, well,
of
no,
course not.
of course not.
Yeah.
I'm not.
Yeah.
But then you don't understand, especially as, all of our industries are education industries. our entertainment industries, all are being sort of forced into understanding critical race theory.
Yes.
And so if we're not aware that it's not just another way of looking at oppression, but that they're actual real baked into the cake issues that reject God, you really need to pay attention to definitions, assumptions, and we need to be better at that. And I think if anyone, as God's people, we need to be paying attention. As Paul said, redeem the times, for the days are evil.
Yeah, and there is an aspect where the terminologies themselves, like I said, it's almost like there are some who enjoy causing confusion with them. I remember specifically writing a paper in grad school where I said, well, this is what this direct definition says this is, and literally 3 different people in class said, that's not what I believe it to be. And I went, okay, what are we talking about? How are we even talking about the same thing? And we don't. That's become part of the problem, is the shifting narratives. Now, language is part of critical theory. The shifting and changing of language is actually one of the direct results of how you compartmentalize these conversations.
Yes.
So how important is for, we've kind of hit on it a little bit, but knowing the language and also noticing when people are changing the language. How important do you think that is for us to notice?
Oh, it's massively important because, with different kinds of conversations, right? That you get into this and you begin to pin down something, you use a certain definition by a certain critical, CRT scholar, and like you said, well, that's not my definition. Okay, well then who has the preferable definition? Yeah. And they always suggest their particular scholar is the one who's got it right. Well, getting back to how words and language and meaning are part of critical theory. Well, I find it ironic and tragically ironic that with one sentence they use all the language I can, but when I wish to rebut them or share with them another CRT perspective, they immediately say, "Well, you can't do that. You're the one shifting."
Yes.
They turn it on you and they go, well, you're just revealing, your oppressive structure. You want to be the one to tell me what I'm supposed to believe. But it gets down to also, I think, the sort of distance with everything's an interpretation, everything is my interpretation.
Or experience. Yes.
And if you go that route, then we can't even have this conversation we're having right now.
In fact, in essence, it becomes what has been termed and coined ethnic Gnosticism. Yes. You would know something solely because of your ethnicity, different than myself, and I could not ever experience it solely because of my ethnicity. And so you kind of come down to the question, then what am I to learn? What can a person learn if there isn't, as in the old, we look in the New Testament, literally the secret knowledge that is kind of implied, this Gnosticism that's played out. And the book of Galatians speaks quite heavily about that.
Yes.
In fact, one of the key things you and I have talked about a lot is how Galatians set forth a very clear, distinctive directive to be careful not to start adding things on top of that. And so that kind of goes to my next question with you. One of the problems that we've run into, especially in the churches, there are clear issues in our culture, in our society, and even in churches, sadly, tragically, that deal with race issues, that deal with these types of things. And they, as you noted there at the end, they must be addressed. You cannot ignore them. You cannot do that. However, using critical race theory, is it the right lens to deal with those problems from a scriptural? Can the Bible and critical race theory coexist?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I highly, let me say it this way. There is nothing that I understand about critical race theory that cannot be derived from traditional understandings of moral realism, historical realism, just realism, things are real. I assume I'm seeing you in reality, that you're not just an interpretation.
Sure.
Right? So there's nothing that CRT offers us that we cannot and have not. It's not like CRT all of a sudden said, there's racism.
Yes.
And we go, unbelievable.
Yes.
Had no clue, brand new information. And I hate. I'm sorry to be a little sarcastic there, but my point is, it has not offered. Instead, it not only points to things we already know, it also slips in naturalism.
Yeah.
It slips in skepticism of knowledge, like epistemological agnosticism.
Yes. Does also, in essence, assume that there is going to be racism in all situations.
Yes, it has to.
That's the tie into Marxism in a lot of
Exactly,
ways.
because it's built on that there's a power structure and there are those who are being oppressed. So if you have a power structure, it doesn't matter. It could be teacher, student. It could be city, citizen. It could be mom, children. Whatever power structure exists, it's oppressive. Moving that toward what we were talking about right now, all it does is it breeds distrust. It breeds distrust.
And it assumes it into
in the worst way.
Yeah, and the other side that I would go with this also, and so you can answer this in some way, does it not also lay forth in essence a concept of ethnic original sin? That you are born inherently either an oppressor or an oppressee.
Yes.
And it does classify the oppressor as someone who is sinful. In fact, I believe it's Ibram Kendi directly uses that terminology, that there is inherent sin in the individual solely by the melanin of their skin. And there's nothing that can be done by that.
Right. You can't even deny it because that's just you
living it continually.
Right.
Yes. And so that becomes such a tragic notion where you accept these theories and the whole Christians who are well-intentioned and well-meaning who need to deal with the tragic issues that we have today of racism and hatred and the rest can get swept up into adding theological views that they've never held, but suddenly they're living out in their everyday life.
Right, because in any time if you were to deny, for example, that racism happened, or just because my ancestors were racist doesn't mean I am.
Yeah.
You get looped right back in. Well, you're still part of the structure, so you are inherently
there's an inherent sin.
You're just stuck.
Yeah.
And no denying it will help you get unstuck.
Yeah. And that's where it adds to, you have in Galatians 1:8, it says, and even if an angel from heaven were to come and to bring to you a new gospel, in essence, there's an essence, and I like to call it the Jesus plus gospel. It's like you need Jesus for salvation, but you also need to know these other authors. You also need to know these constructs that you live. And so Jesus wasn't enough. The cross of the Christ, his sacrifice on the cross was not enough for salvation. So even if you were to accept the premise that, yes, I inherit the sin of others, Jesus is not enough to cover those things. And that becomes a highly problematic theology for a person of faith, a person who is a Christian. So we could go on for hours on this. Literally, we have, in fact, for quite a few years. But we have two more questions that are coming up that we're so excited about. And so we want to invite you back with us at 7 p.m. Eastern. We will kick off our next question, which will be, is biblical justice the same as social justice? And so this is going to tie straight in from this question. We look forward to having you back with us, hopefully just in a few minutes. Hope you can join us then. Welcome back, everyone. So grateful for your attendance this evening. If you're watching online, let us know where you're tuning in from. If you're watching this after the fact, also let us know where you're tuning in from. We'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions, or if you want to follow up with anything that you see or hear tonight, we'd love to know more about that. My name is Brandon Edwards, and I am the college minister here at the Church of Christ on Fishinger Road, and also the campus director for the Buckeyes for Christ program for The Ohio State University. So grateful to have you here for our second to last, our penultimate question that we have for this wonderful series of 12 questions. And tonight we are heading into what is a continuation in some ways of the previous question: is social justice the same as biblical justice? I'm very excited to be able to introduce Jovan Paez again as he comes back to answer a second question for us tonight. He is out in California and works full-time for the Highland Church of Christ in Bakersfield, California. He is a noted scholar and apologist, and we're so grateful for his time to come and answer this question: is social justice the same as biblical justice? Don't want to take any more of his time, so I'll turn it over to Jovan. Jovan?
Thank you, Brandon. Again, really excited to be here tonight. So we're going to get into, just jump right in. Is social justice the same as biblical justice? And I'd like to just say, short of it is yes and no. And it really depends, the yes and the no really depends on our definitions. And it really depends on our focus regarding social justice. However, what I'm going to be doing is really focusing on sort of a more contemporary emphasis on social justice. And in this case then, for the most part, I'm going to say no. That the contemporary framework for social justice and its comparative, biblical justice, they're not on the same page. They're not on the same page. We're going to start with asking a question: what kind of thing is justice? It might seem like a really weird question, but in really getting into this, we have to understand that justice means something. We are dealing with either a construct, something that's based straight out of our mind, something that we have pulled together, a definition that is sociologically derived. It's construct. I mean, we have constructs all the time, and I'm not saying that constructs by themselves are bad, but what I am saying is it a construct? Is it just a subjective, interpretive construct? And those three words I want to get into. So subjective means, again, it's something that I see and I understand, and yet you may not agree with me on that. It is my opinion, it is my assessment, and it may not actually line up with fact. It may not line up with fact. It may not line up with the reality of the external world I live in. So subjective is a loaded word too, because it has different connotations in different settings. But the way I'm going to use it today, so as you think about this, make sure you understand how I'm using the word subjective is part of my personal experience of looking at the world, believing I can understand it to an extent, and that I can perhaps understand things as they are outside of me, and from that pull together a definition of what a thing might be. That doesn't mean, however, it's an absolute objective reality. You might say, well, what in the world are we doing now? Well, the contrast is an objective reality is I am standing on this platform. It is not an opinion. This is something that is real, and it is something you see. If you were to be in my place, it would do exactly the same thing it's doing for me. It's an objective reality. It's something we can all agree on. We might disagree on the color scheme. As you know, if you've gone on social media over the several years, people are arguing over what a color is on a certain item, and we all can't seem to agree, and that's not what we're doing here. Is it merely, let me ask the second question, is justice then just a subjective interpretive construct, or is it objective? Is it merely an instanced in a particular person? Is justice something that's instanced in a person? And what I mean by that is, going back to our previous talk about nominalism, where there are no transcendent essences that we can all share. There's one essence, and we can share it, all of us, the same numeric weight or value. On nominalism, we cannot. We cannot share. We all have instanced or particular instances of a particular value of varying weight or numeric value for each person who experiences it. So is justice that? Is it just a personal or a instant where we see justice at work or at play? Is it just something we're going to name justice, but it just is that particular experience? Again, that's very subjective. Is it merely instanced in a particular person's behavior? So it's kind of what I just said. But the contrast is, some people see that a person can be just. Others would argue a person cannot be just, they can just do just things. So there's this contrast there. I want to make sure you understand that. Is justice a shareable, transcendent essence? Which, if you already know where I'm coming from, you'll know that I would say yes, it is. But moving on to nominalism itself, when we look at justice from this perspective, and remember, nominalism is fundamental to Marxism, it's fundamental to empiricism, it's fundamental to naturalism, and therefore it's a leg, and a significant leg, to critical race theory, critical theory, and even intersectionality. On nominalism, justice is just subjective, and it's interpretive, and it's a construct. Because it's a construct, it's not real. It only matters to the person who has constructed the idea. It's only true to the person who's constructed the idea. So it's subjective. And because it's interpreted, and you have to appreciate how interpretation is viewed and valued in this kind of mental space. Interpretation means, getting back to a philosopher by the name of Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant said, I can know a phenomenon, I could see a phenomenon, but I cannot truly know it. I cannot truly know its, he would use the word nomen. I cannot truly know something within itself. It may exist, it may totally exist, but I can't know it. I can only understand what I interpret. Kant has influenced the entire discussion of interpretation. But here's a problem. If I see, for example, this chair that's next to me over here, I go, I'm interpreting what I see. Now that I have my interpretation, I'm now thinking about my interpretation. Well, guess what happens next? On this view that interpretations are subjective, I have to now appreciate my interpretation, and I've now just created another interpretation of my interpretation. Kantian epistemic knowledge pushes you further back. It's almost like a regression that never stops. to the point that you'll never know something within itself. Now, you may not think on those terms, but the short of that is this. There is this chair. On realism, there is this chair, and it's there, it's real, I'll sit on it, it's great, wonderful. But under Kantian's skepticism of knowing something in itself, I'll never know what this chair really is. Isn't that a sad and tragic way of looking at the world? And yet that is the skepticism baked into the cake of a lot of our modern approaches to values and ethics, knowledge. And it has provided the skepticism upon which relativism lives. It has provided the fertile ground where our postmodern world thrives. Justice on those merits is just a personal, subjective, interpreted construct. On nominalism, it is merely an instanced thing in a person, a particular person. So that means if you were a person who believed that an essence like justice could exist, as a virtue in a person, then it would just only be in that person. And it may be instanced in another person, but the two are not the same. And I know I sound redundant, but it's really important that I am. It's really important that I am. But the weight or the numeric value of each essence of justice is not the same. So you can actually pick whose justice is more weighty. You can actually kind of, not pick, but you can almost understand that there is no single universal standard. Universals are out. Subjectivism is in. Justice on nominalism could be instanced in behavior, but only so long as that behavior continues to occur. But guess what? And it's only instanced in that particular person's behavior. It will appear differently or have a different weight in another person's instance behavior. You might really be scratching your head right now. Trust me, so have I been. And it's really one of those amazing things that you go, people really believe this. And I'm not making fun of the philosophical world on this. I'm saying I understand the thought process and I appreciate working through these things. These are really deep, what might be called metaphysical issues. And yet, the practical implications for that is entirely overwhelming. Justice on nominalism, on Marxism, on these theories make it such that it's not a universal. It is not a universal at all. It is a particular thing that exists. So you can have a justice experience and you can be doing justice, but your actions or your experience or your sense, they're not the same. You cannot share injustice as a thing within itself because it only materializes in the individual. It is not a universal shared experience. Now, getting to this question about intersectionality, let me say one more thing here. On theories like nominalism, empiricism, materialism, Marxism, critical theory, and all the other ones, it is strictly tied. Modern, contemporary, social justice is strongly tied to people who are in groups of conflict within a society, in a culture. That is the framework of Marxism. It has merged and become a very different baby. Marxism has become something else, and it has been used and mutated, essentially, in these other ways or prisms to look at society. Intersectionality, then, has helped quantify or at least isolate different instances of injustice. So it goes down to what is your race, your ethnicity, your socioeconomical background, your biography, your history. There are numerous factors. The quote-unquote calculus of intersectionality is part of modern social justice. I took this from the Center for Intersectional Justice. It's online, you can look it up, but listen to this. What is intersectionality? This is what they told me. And here's a quote, and I have a full quote for you in a moment here. But the concept of intersectionality describes the ways in which systems of inequality based on gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, class, and other forms of discrimination intersect to create unique dynamics and effects. I'm going to let you look at this for a minute. Just pour over those words again. Notice how many categories, and then it goes on and says, and other forms. Well, what other forms? As many forms as you need. Or that might be instanced in terms of new forms of oppression, new forms of discrimination, new forms of identities, new forms of instances on this grid. And all of them then can make a claim toward injustice, oppression, some sort of system that they must overthrow in order to experience equity or equality. And those words are loaded by themselves from a sociological perspective about equity, equality, and other ways of sharing into the value of a workplace in a given society, but we're not going to get into that. The next slide is the full quote. And let me add here from what I read here, because they give you an example. For example, when a Muslim woman wearing hijab is being discriminated, it would be impossible to dissociate her female form from her Muslim identity and to isolate the dimensions causing her discrimination. All forms of inequality are mutually reinforcing and must therefore be analyzed and addressed simultaneously to prevent one form of inequality from reinforcing another form. For example, tackling the gender pay gap alone without including other dimensions such as race, socioeconomic status, and immigration status will likely reinforce inequalities among women. So in other words, you can't just say there's a gender pay gap. You have to say there's a gender, transgender, there is, a black, there is African American, there's Hispanic American, there's Asian American. You have to keep adding and stacking the deck, so to speak. You have to keep stacking the profile in order to illustrate a particular instanced discrimination. So can you imagine? And here's one of my critiques about this, my concern. Where is the terminus? Where is the drop? Where's the bottom of this? Theoretically, on intersectionality, there is never going to be a bottom. There will always be a intersectional instance popped up that we haven't addressed, because we can just keep adding. This is an indefinite mentality. Again, remember, because all of these things are instanced, they're particular, they're subjective. They may use empirical systems looking strictly on nature, the natural world, and they will look at these objective, empirical elements of society, and they emphasize those things rather than the inherent value of dignity that every human being has by virtue of who they are and what a human is. What kind of thing is a human? Made in the image of God. And regardless of economics, regardless of ethnicity, every human being should have dignity, and we should deal with injustices. But that's essentially where we find ourselves on intersectionality. So moving forward, we also see then that on intersectionality, justice is sociologically based on particular segments of society. Particular segments in whom we see that they experience discriminatory inequalities based on those. It is the claim, it is the experience, whether real or felt or historically accurate, it's immaterial. It is a justice based on where one is plotted in society. If I could say it in the most, I think, common way, where you're plotted. Are you in the oppressive system, or are you in the oppressed group? And the emphasis is not on the oppressors, the emphasis is on the oppressed. But on biblical ethics, justice, as it finds its essence as being an extension of who God is, it is a shareable, transcendent essence. Because it belongs to God first. And when He made us in His image and in His likeness. He shares attributes, essences that transcend who we are, but something we can share. So we're made in His likeness. We are not God, but we share the likeness. We share in His image. We are not the image of God, but we share in the image of God. It is something we can experience. It is something we can have. It is something we can do as well. Biblical ethics tells us that justice is in essence independent of the material world or immaterial or material realism. Let me explain a little more here. So, for the longest, the view of what the nature of, the constitution of what a human is has usually been around, we have a dual nature. We have a physical nature. It's the one we can touch. It's the one that has muscles. It is the one that smiles. It is the one we hug, the one we love. A physical nature. Allows us to interact in our physical world. And, when we try to break the laws of physics, if two things cannot occupy the same space at the same time, we know that. We know what that feels like. But we also have an immaterial element or aspect or essence of who we are in our dualistic nature. We have an immaterial part of us, the spirit, the soul. On biblical ethics or virtue ethics, justice is a part of that independent, immaterial world. It exists within a material world, but it is independent of it. So, justice is a virtue, and it is an essence. What's the difference between the two? Well, just to help us in a very popular kind of way, we can either do it or we can be it. When it is something we can share, it is something we can do, it's something we can be, then we have sort of worked through the virtue and the essence of it. So how does this impact our knowledge of biblical justice? Well, we have a few more things to point out here. One, it's really important to appreciate what the Bible tells us about this. One, we're made in the image of God. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27 tells us that, that God made mankind in His image and in His likeness, and He made us male and female. And because we're made in His image, we then have been blessed to bear that image. And that means justice then begins with this, or human justice begins with this communicable, the shareable blessing of His nature and His virtue. But at the same time, because we're free will beings, we must choose to be virtuous. We must choose to be just. We must choose to do justice, mercy, compassion, kindness. So being human gives us the ability to share this transcendent virtue, this transcendent aspect of our relationship to God by virtue of being created in His image. But we actually have to participate in this. It is not ours by default, at least not now after the fall. But we are capable of doing it and being just and being holy. Furthermore, this means that throughout the entire biblical teaching, we find, like in the stories of the Good Samaritan, we find stories in the stories of Jesus, how He loved His neighbor, cared for them, healed the sick, helped the poor, cast out demons, did miracles. All of these examples that we see in Luke chapter 4 and Luke chapter 5, we see Jesus doing good to all the people. We see that part of that is bringing light to those in darkness. We see that giving sight to the blind and letting the lame walk. And we see the early church, though equipped for some time with apostles who could do similar things, the fundamental work of the church is to do goodness, mercy, compassion, kindness. And here's a good, I think you'll appreciate this if you're really concerned of how biblical justice plays into this. And this is a little bit of Bible history. So when the New Testament was being composed, the letters come first. The letters were published first. Most of all the letters came before the Gospels were ever published as a book. Now think about this for a second. The letters really show that the church is supposed to love each other and care for people, and there's a lot of morality and virtue ethics about how to live and how to care for others. But later, around maybe the 50s and into the 60s, and maybe even a little later, like in the Gospel of John, the stories of Jesus are then put into written form for the early church to kind of have a permanent form of what Jesus looked like in terms of what He did, how He was virtuous, the kind of what we might call biblical social justice that He did. Unfortunately, the church has tried different models of social justice. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, really, there was this attempt to do something called the social gospel. And it was really designed to help and be a part of the betterment of mankind. To help men and mankind maybe learn a trade, have some sort of welfare system, but it was detached. It was detached from the gospel. In other words, you could be in a Christian ministry and care for people, and you never taught them to follow Jesus. And this became a popularized form of Christianity. The betterment of the brotherhood of mankind, and the essence of Christianity. And it really had a theological basis. That has been disastrous because you love people into the graves, but don't prepare them for heaven. Biblical justice, on the other hand, or caring for the neighbor, has much to do about showing compassion, being an asset to your neighborhood, being of support to those around you in need, whether in the church or out the church. You're not only doing that, but you're sharing Jesus and you're making it every bit gospel that Jesus showed us in His own life. So when I boil it down then, based on the distinctions between the modern the modern justice system that people are trying to do based on intersectionality, it is incompatible because it goes back to the same problem that it only focuses on people's social positions in society. It does not deal with what a human is, and it doesn't care, nor does it believe that such a thing as human dignity exists as a standard that is objective, that is an immaterial, shareable essence. Everything is just subjective. Biblical justice looks at the person as created in the image of God, seeing them in their need, seeing them in their fallen state, and then bringing them the compassion and love of Jesus and the love of God, doing God's work, but also following in the teaching of Jesus to help them so that they might learn to turn to Jesus and go and sin no more. And that's the difference. Thank you.
Thanks, Jovan. Come on over. We'll have a seat and we'll continue the conversation, in essence. So one of the things that you noted is a lot about this, how much this ties into our last question in a lot of ways, how much it actually deals with the concept of critical theory, critical race theories, all tied in, especially through intersectionality. And so many people, when they throw out again the words social justice, it inherently sounds like something everybody should be for.
Yeah.
And there's the implication that if you're not for this, then you're not really caring about others. You don't really have the compassion. And as was noted on one of our earlier nights, there's an aspect to this is not new to me, but it's a terminology that I use of weaponized empathy. That social justice and biblical justice have been conflated to be the same thing, but as you noted, they're very different concepts. In fact, philosophically, they're completely different. Theologically, they're completely different. So directly on intersectionality. Intersectionality is not something a lot of people spend a lot of time on. They've probably heard about it before. What's a good way of understanding the concept of where things intersect and why that matters in social justice?
Yeah, so as I understand it, there's one sociologist, and I can't remember his name right now, but he describes your position in society as part history, part biography. So if you're going to understand yourself, it's important to know your history and your personal history. Intersectionality makes your position, your biography, and sort of your situatedness as where they focus on what is going to take for you to overcome your oppression. So
it becomes paramount, in essence. It becomes everything.
Yeah, and so it's really self-focused. And it's unfortunate. Like, I have no problem with people being aware of any history of oppression in their life. I think that's important, it's essential. But it becomes the virtue. It becomes the virtue, and it becomes therefore very emotionally loaded.
Yes. So with that in mind, in fact, one of the ways I've liked to describe intersectionality to people is it's almost like a reverse pyramid, where you have a structure of power typically with the pyramid and the one person at top.
Right.
There seems to be almost, and for lack of a better terminology, a race to the bottom to see who can have the most intersections, because if your identity is placed directly in your position in society, and the more oppressed you are, the more, in essence, power you now find. It would seem that would be kind of this race to see who you could have. Do you see that happening much in our culture right now?
Oh, definitely. Just what was it? We were really starting to see that, and it could be my antennas, but I remember when, as this began to really take public stage, if you recall, while there was an emphasis on the African American experience, all of a sudden, the Asian Americans started going, What
about us?
We have, this sort of oppressive system too. And I remember, to some extent, going, have people forgotten the Hispanic story?
Sure.
And what I'm saying by that is not so much as I want to use it to champion things, but the idea is, yes, I see that the more you focus on where you're plotted, the more you're going to find people going, I need to be emphasizing this about myself. I'm a third generation Hispanic. Part of me is indigenous, so my family has dealt with the colonization of Spanish America. Like, if all of a sudden I'm stacking my deck and I'm no longer basing, I want to use the word worth. I'm not basing it on my character. I'm basing it on my history.
Yeah.
My history is
Yeah.
not me, though.
Yeah.
My demographics is not me. It is just as the bed I sleep in is not me, and the clothes I wear is not me. The intersectional approach to people is not really them.
Yeah. So would that be, I mean, in some ways, what kind of goes after is this idea of building your identity almost off of the things that you could not change. You cannot change, but they become everything about you.
Right.
For example, I've grown up not just, I could look at my parents' jobs and what they had, and my grandparents and the rest, and look at, farmers and immigrants and the rest going back. But for whatever reason, in some ways, I don't look at that as having defined me. I look back and sometimes there's pride, sometimes there's shame. All of those happen when you look back in the different sides of families. But not one time have I ever stopped and said those directly define who I am in this moment. But it seems to be the philosophy of the day, in essence, is you cannot change the things about you from your past. And there's one way in which that's true. You can't change those things. But they also define you in everything that you are.
It's a type of determinism.
Yes.
And that you can never be other than.
Yes.
And that's a problem. If you can never be other than, then you have no free will. You are trapped forever being what you are.
And if that's in your mindset, then you, in essence, have to go after the structures that may have set forth those things.
Exactly. Because that's the only way you will have the kind of social change that will free you.
And so social justice, it's clear from the definitions that you've given that social justice is antithetical to biblical justice.
Right.
For one, it has a very deterministic aspect to it, the nominalism that it plays out, but it also focuses far more on the things of this world.
Right.
In fact, you could probably make some correlations to the zealots of the first century whose Messiah was specifically supposed to come to overthrow the oppressor, the Romans.
Right.
And you see even the apostles at times turning to Jesus going, at this time, are you going to restore the kingdom of Israel?
Right.
At this time, are we going to take down the oppressor? And Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. That's not the reason or why I came. But we have a lot of individuals, even within churches today, that seems to be, that's the goal, that's the mantra, is the overturning of the systems of this world. And as you noted, to the direct detriment of even the actual sharing of the gospel, life-changing gospel.
Right.
So what would you say to those churches? What would you say to those people who want to mean well? And I've said over and over again, I rarely have met anybody who doesn't mean well in these scenarios. They're not antagonistic inherently. Many of them don't know a lot of the backgrounds to these things. So what would you encourage them in with this difference between the social justice movement in our world, modern one, and the actual concepts of biblical justice?
Yeah, that's, well, I would love to have a face-to-face, but, if I could, I think part of my concern would be, let's make sure we're grounded first on the right stuff. That's the bottom line. What are we grounded on? Number one, we live in a fallen world. Let's just be clear. All has sinned and fallen short of the glory of the Lord. So there's never going to be a hierarchy or a social system that is perfect.
Yeah. And
that means there's always going to be some inequality. There's always going to be some sort of, sense of, I wish I had, someone has taken my spot, someone has taken, and we're going to react to things. So we need, one, let's really get down to the roots of the problem. It's sin. Ultimately, it's the state of man. Though we're made in the image of God, we live in this state now. Number two, I would really encourage the person to really think through the outcome. What is the end here? Is the end just strictly to overthrow the so-called oppressive system? Let me give you an example real quick. So I grew up in San Francisco, and during the lockdown, they took a lot of heat, the District of San Francisco, trying to rename all the high schools because they wanted to remove names like Abraham Lincoln, they wanted to remove George Washington, they wanted to remove all these names because someone had detected in their history, whether it was there were slave owners, or they went down and said Abraham Lincoln did not do the Emancipation Proclamation because he was truly anti-racist or anti-slavery. It was just pragmatic. So because it was pragmatic, even on that merit, he
Couldn't have a name.
He couldn't have
Yeah.
the school named after it. And then I started thinking, well, whose names do you put on the school? And I guarantee you, you have those names up long enough.
They too will be brought
They
down.
too, because we live in a fallen world. We sin.
Yeah.
We all have bad histories. Some spots in our histories are worse than others. And everyone at some point has been called into question for the injustices they've done. And so what happens when your entire ethic is on that?
Yeah.
What is the end goal? Because it becomes cyclical.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. Biblical justice is not cyclical. It pushes us to help others, love others, show compassion to others, so that they may have the support they need. Kind of like in Galatians 6, if anyone is overtaken in sin, you who are spiritual, go to the one, restore them, lift them up, so that they can be other than what they were.
Well, that seems like a fantastic way to end this conversation. We're so grateful for all of you who've tuned in up to this point in time. We have one more question to go, 8 p.m. Eastern time tonight, one more question. And candidly, I can't think of a better one to end on. What is forgiveness? In fact, it kind of goes hand in hand with all of these things we've talked about, and especially with what you just noted right there. So I invite you to come back with us just here in a few minutes at 8 p.m. Eastern. We'll see you then. Welcome back, everyone. It is our last question. We're so grateful you're back with us, and we cannot tell you how much we've enjoyed this and spending time with all of you that are here in our audience live, all of you watching online. We're so grateful for your presence. Wherever you're tuning in from, let us know. We've already been tagged in a couple of photos tonight and rest, having some watch parties in different places. Love to see that. So grateful for your presence. We have one more question tonight that we're going to be dealing with, and this is our last one. And I'm so grateful that Jovan Paez, noted scholar and apologist from California, is here with us to answer this question. It is candidly one that will hopefully feel a little bit cathartic with all the different discussions we've had over these last 4 days to actually look at this premise, this concept, especially after these last two questions of what is forgiveness. And I can say this was the most asked question in some form or fashion by the students and others here at Ohio State University. What is forgiveness? What does it look like? How can one forgive? How do you learn to let go? All of those different things were part of this, and I'm so grateful that we have a man who has spent so much time in study and preparations for this to answer it. I don't want to take any more of his time, so I'll turn it over now to Jovan Paez.
Thank you, everyone. And we are going to deal with the question of forgiveness. And as we do get into this, I started thinking about what this question really is, and the fact that so many on the campus asked this question really, in light of tonight's two questions, really made me think and really want to ask a question in my own. Why are we having so much trouble with the idea of forgiveness? Why even the question? I really, to be fair, I thought, okay, Marxism, critical race theory, that seems reasonable as a question on a college campus. Social justice, biblical justice, where do they meet, where they don't? Seemed reasonable. And then what is forgiveness? And I gotta say, I was really puzzled. Not because I don't, at least in my own life, experience or have experienced forgiveness, but why is that a question? And it may have something to do with the other two questions we addressed. In these critical theories, there is never, it's seemingly, an opportunity for forgiving. We're always victims. They're always oppressors. And maybe it's a side effect. Maybe it's an unintended side effect. Because as I'll share with you tonight, a preview is forgiveness empowers us and the person we forgive to be other than we are. I'll explain what I mean. So as we jump into forgiveness, the first thing I want to tell you is, from a biblical point of view, I want to zero in on a particular word, aphiemi or aphiemi, depending on how, if you study Greek, you might pronounce that word. But in the New Testament, there's a word for forgiveness. It's the flagship word for forgiveness, translated forgiveness. It means to let go. It means to let go. It can be used in people being released from prison. It can be used for releasing people from obligations. It can be used for a number of things. So the idea of just the concept of forgiveness is the idea of letting it go. So when God forgives his people, he's letting the consequence of punishment He's letting us go. He's releasing us from those consequences. Of course, in his justice, Jesus has taken our place. But for our personal experience, he has let us go. And I find that powerful. That God doesn't make our wrongs unwrong. He doesn't change them into goods. He doesn't make our vices into virtues. He doesn't make our sins into good deeds. But when it comes down to the righteous standard of God and the judgment due it, he lets us go from the consequence of it. And if we really appreciate it from that perspective, instead of, can I say, dare I say, kind of a word that's kind of stuck in the church, forgiveness. I think it's one of those words we use a lot that has a very strong emotional, personal meaning that I almost feel in our growing secular society, it's losing contact, losing connection. And isn't that tragic? Isn't that a tragic reality to face, that learning to let things go is not in our kind of contemporary zeitgeist, like our contemporary kind of way of looking at the world. I grew up in the streets. I was a gangbanger. I have a little picture for you to look at. That's me. You may not see my face on that. Trying to protect the innocent or whatever. But this kid, he ran the streets, ran away from cops, jumped behind people's backyards, ran from dogs, violent. I was the kid, I was part of the whole system, if we're going to call it that, we use systems. I was part of the system where parents would say to their kids, don't be out too late because something bad might happen to you. I was the thing that might happen to you. Been taken to the police station plenty of times, picked up by the police plenty of times, and I was completely given into this. When I turned 18, I was completely shocked because by that point I had already become a Christian, and 18 in the street is an old man. If you made it past 17 or 18. So I was a high school dropout. I was probably at the park or someplace getting high, getting drunk, mostly every day. My high school attendance cards that would come home were always reversed. You might see 4 days absence. What were you missing those 4 days? No, it was the other way around. My mom said, why were you gone 200 days? I didn't go to school. And there's nothing my mom could do. She was a single mom. She had to go to work. She could not skip work and do stuff. So, I did drugs, sold drugs. I wasn't a dealer. It's a very different phenomenon. It's like if I sold you a book from my library, I'm not a bookstore, right? And I gave in to all those things. Hung out in the downtown Tenderloin of San Francisco sometimes, which was essentially the red light district. I had friends who were pimps, and I had friends who would find girls and turn them into prostitutes. And I remember one time a girl called home. I remember her standing in the payphone, and she called home, and I heard her say, Mom, Dad, I'm not coming home. This guy's going to take care of me. And I just stood there and go, he's really not. And by street rules, you don't want to ever get taken advantage of, but if someone else is going to allow themselves to be, you just kind of let it ride. But one day, a lot of things began to hit me, and I knew I was not ready to meet God. I did not want to meet God. I had never stopped acknowledging that God existed, but I lived as if he didn't. Today we call that practical atheism. And what ended up happening was I reached out to God, and it changed my life. I began reading the Bible. I found a Bible under my bed. I had no idea it was there. No idea it was there. And I began to read Jesus, the Gospels, the stories of Jesus. And I remember distinctly in the Gospel of Mark when Jesus was confronted by a leper. And he said, asked Jesus to have compassion on him. And the text says, and Jesus looked at him and he had compassion for him and he touched him. And I remember I wanted Jesus to touch me too. I wanted to be able to report to someone that Jesus touched me and that I'm healed. Because for that man, he was no longer a leper. Right? He was no longer a leper. He was no longer an outcast. He was no longer robbed from the community. He was no longer living in colonies and falling apart and experiencing the corruptive nature of his disease. He was whole, and Jesus brought him back to his mama, his daddy, his family, the temple, religious life. And I wanted that. The leper could be other than what he was. And I wanted to be other than the street gangbanger who, though I do not have a record, probably could. And this is my crew. At least part of it. This picture is taken from after a gang fight, and this is a second copy taken by the SFPD. A copy of this was in their gang task force book, and they gave me a second copy. A few of my friends in this picture have been shot or crippled, been in prison for over 10 years. Some of them dead. But here's the first thing I want you to understand about biblical forgiveness. Forgiveness is not an emotion. Forgiveness is not an emotion. There may be emotion attached to it. And I'm not saying here that when you read the Bible, forgiveness from the part of the forgiver is emotionless. But biblically speaking, it is a choice of will to let someone go for whom you're holding or withholding forgiveness. When God forgives us, there were things that he was holding us accountable to in terms of his justice and holy standard. There's a standard. Just like in our civil world, we have standards. Not every society follows them, and we don't always follow all of them. Some communities can be pretty strict when it comes to jaywalking. Another, they don't care. Everyone jaywalks. In my hometown in Bakersfield right now, you can drive when it's red. Red in my town is just like another green. And it seems like no one cares. But with God, for God to be holy, there is a holy standard. And when we sin, we violate that holy standard. And he does hold us accountable to that. When we come before him and we have contact with the blood of Jesus, he lets the consequence, the judgment day consequences go. Because Jesus took our place. The innocent for the guilty. But forgiveness is not first an emotion. And I say that because I know a lot of people, they're like, I just can't forgive that person. And usually what's holding back the act is the emotion. And I've often wrestled with this. Look, I've been the villain in plenty of people's stories. I have. But there have been plenty of people in my life who've been the villain in my life. Without going into a lot of my backstory. But I've learned that even when, at the end of the day, I'm not fully satisfied because I have personal desires to make someone who hurt me feel it, I've learned that the more I learn to follow God's lead and learn to let go of things when things are made right as best as can be done, because some things cannot be made right 100% or even, 50%. I've learned that the act far outweighs in value and merit my grudges, because they teach me to have a reserve that I never thought I could. I never thought that I could forgive someone who has so violated me or betrayed me, who leveraged friendship to stab me in the back. I never thought I could forgive someone who abandoned me for years. I never thought I could do any of those things. I never thought that I could become friends with some of the former rivals in my neighborhood. But once I learned how to release them, I learned what might be something that God does, and I have come to appreciate my forgiveness even more. That as an act of faithfulness to His promise and His love, His devotedness, He has created an opportunity for me, the druggy gangbanger, to be something other than. In a world where we tell each other, you will never be other than what you are, to be other than is almost miraculous. And this is what forgiveness does. It's an act that is not strictly emotional. It may, as I said, attach itself to emotion, and it will, and it should, but it's strictly, in my understanding, not an emotional act. It allows us to be other than. That means that when we forgive someone and when we experience forgiveness, there's an opportunity for both the forgiver and the forgiven to move forward and be different. You don't have to be wounded anymore. You can be other than the wounded person. You can be the healing person. You get to be the person with reserves of grace and compassion. You can be other than the bitter, angry person, the wounded, the broken. When you're the forgiven, you have a chance to do right by the forgiveness, to be other than the violator, the perpetrator, the corrupt. You can be other than. Otherwise, we're locked into a determinism that is essential slavery. To be enslaved to your actions because you'll never be other than that. To be enslaved by the decisions of your predecessors that you will never be other than that. This is why it really struck a chord with me when Brandon said that this was a question from the college people of the campus. And I think the difficulty or the curiosity here is, because we live in a fallen world and because we're sinners, because we do these things, and we're not shown how the forgiving experience looks like, because the greatest forgiver of all time is excluded from their daily interactions, God. We have no model of forgiveness. We only have model of punitive behavior reactions. We only know how to punish each other. That's what's going on. And that's one of the problems with critical race theory. That's one of the problems with things like that. Here's a picture of me side by side, two different gangs. On the left is me with my street gang, and on the other side is me with a missionary team in Panama. I never imagined I could have been other than. I never imagined that. And I hope you can see then that you can be other than. You don't have to be locked in. You know, in the church I run into a lot of people, they're like, well, I messed up before I got married, and I understand that. I was not a virtuous person before I got married. But I was other than when I got married. You don't have to be enslaved to your sins, your failures. God is committed to us so that we can be other than. And that means through the cross, we see that God has shown us, we have the famous passage, John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever should believe in him should have eternal life. God's forgiving love acted preemptively. In other words, God didn't wait for us to go and say, God, can you fix this? Can you do something? He was already on task. And it teaches me that we have to learn to be preemptive. Sometimes we wait for someone to apologize for us to do the heart work. The heart, the T, the heart work before we forgive people. We wait for them because then we go, they haven't apologized, so I can be angry. They haven't apologized, so I can hold a grudge. They haven't apologized, so I can justify my grumpiness. But if we're going to learn from God, we have to learn to heal and be ready to forgive verbally when the time comes. Because that's what God did. That's what God did. So as we conclude, I just wanted to help you kind of see some angles of what forgiveness is. And especially point us back to Jesus and to God, who show us that forgiveness is an act. It is emotion loaded, but it's not primarily emotion. It gives us an opportunity to be other than. Both the forgiver can be other than, both the forgiven can be other than. And what a powerful witness to the world that the church is. Paul said to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, some of you were adulterers. Some of you were thieves. Some of you were effeminate. Some of you were homosexual. Some of you. Such were some of you, but you were washed, you were cleansed, you were sanctified in the blood of Jesus Christ. They became other than. They were forgiven. That's the power of forgiveness. Thank you.
Thanks, Jovan. Come on over. I'm grateful for this last question. In fact, one of the students who first asked this question, I could tell there was something more behind it even when they were asking it. That there may have been some type of own trauma in their own life about feeling needing forgiveness, wanting forgiveness. And so I wasn't surprised. I was surprised by how many different types of questions came in, specifically about the premise of forgiveness. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head in essence, because this isn't something that's experienced much in our world. punitive, reactionary, in fact, seems to be the mantra of not just our world, but just take social media into account. The idea that anybody would be stepped on, anybody would get walked all over, instantly we are supposed to stand up for ourselves. We're supposed to do all those things. And forgiveness is not even spoken to as an option. Do you think that's part of why so many people are struggling with this right now?
Absolutely. I think, hopefully Twitter will become something other than Twitter bitter, with the new regime. But I use Twitter as an example where we live in a global society in which we want to shame each other for our failures and mistakes, no matter how old they were.
Yeah.
No matter we're all like error detectives, and I think that has become, unfortunately, I think part of that has also become part of the coin of the realm of social media. So we're sort of socializing ourselves to critique people and to comment on people. Your face is fat, your face is flat, your face is round. Like critiquing people, and then you add, I can't believe you did that. Yeah. I can't believe you said that. Personalities, people are not flat. People have texture, and so we're definitely, it's not an accident, in my opinion. It's not an accident that we struggle with this, and I think that's why the church is such a powerful place to be, because in theory and in practice, we should be the best case study of people being other than because they were forgiven.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, part of that, if you look also at our culture right now, we're seeing a massive uptick in anxieties and depressions and the rest. And so much of it seems to be centered around the pressure to conform to perfection, to this ideal of perfection. In fact, so often we've talked about the weaponized empathy, and we've talked about these perceptions, because in the same way we're tearing down, thus we're setting forth also a standard by which everyone must live, but it's an untenable standard. And so you see suicide rates skyrocketing, and people trying to find themselves in different ways, reinvent themselves even in different ways. You see gender dysphoria, you see all these different concepts that are coming about, and so much of it seems to be tied down to, because there's nothing that can be grasped, nothing tangible that can be grasped, where there is something other than, something other than what they are or what we are in that moment. And so how can the church do better at showing the other than?
So, my experience has been mostly positive when it comes to my process of going from what I was, meeting Jesus, and being other than. At times, we have gotten too concerned, I'm going to use the word concerned, about testimony. Yeah. In other words, we are afraid that by telling how God has redeemed us, saved us, changed us, we're somehow, that the emphasis is on me. On the self, that it's become a selfish experience. And while I'm not advocating that we take a portion of our worship service and turn it into a testimonial segment, I do believe it's vital that we become more open and that people's stories, who are willing to tell them, let us know it's okay.
Because the church at times does have a perception of perfection, doesn't it?
Yes.
Like we portray a facade at times, and everything's fine, everything's good, everybody's fine here. When we all know the reality is that's not true. During the week, people have struggles and they have problems, and there may be people at times, even though Scripture says differently, that where you're sitting in the services and you have issues with people there that have not been dealt with. But we do at times put up that facade, don't we?
We do. We definitely do. And because there's a really great book called The Safest Place on Earth by Larry Crabb. And he talks about, he's a Christian philosopher, not Christian counselor, excuse me. And he, in this book, we had a really great imagery. He said, we have all these pews facing one way. What if we could imagine in our minds, we could turn them to each other and see how God is transforming each other?
Yeah. Well, that'd be a fascinating concept, because one of the major struggles for so many is, in some ways, is even, I'll put it this way, even learning to forgive yourself for things.
Right.
And ironically, there's actually a bit of a narcissism that's involved in that, where the only person that can save you really is you, if you constantly relive all the things, where you don't let God be the one who saves you, who has changed you from the way you were before. And so many people will say, well, God could never forgive that. God could never forgive me. And we're always making comparisons to Christians we see, or Christians who have made a perception of themselves that seems to be better than others. And that's such a danger for the church.
Oh, definitely. When you mentioned a few things here, when you can't forgive yourself, you can't forgive other people. Like when you cannot forgive yourself for your sins or your struggles or the fact that you struggle, then I've learned personally and through working with people that it's even harder to forgive someone else. Because, you start to, it's sort of this, you almost create an image of the person, but usually it's yourself you're creating.
Yeah.
And it just becomes a toxic situation. What we really need is conversations about this very thing, learning to forgive ourselves, learning that, because when I read the New Testament, I read about how Paul is the last person, according to human standards, who should be able to forgive himself.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
He's the last person because he persecuted the church. He destroyed congregations. He voted against people, probably in death sentence situations. He was an avid destroyer of the church. Yeah. And yet, I'm always fascinated with one mouth, with one stroke of his pen, he can say, I am the chiefest of the sinners. But then he can say, but then God has called me.
Yeah.
And it's this, this powerful, in 1 Timothy chapter 1, or I think it's verses 10 to 12, Paul says that I was a sinner, I was the chief among sinners, but God called me to be in his service. And the thing I learned is God will call us out on our sins, but he doesn't leave us there.
Yeah. Yeah.
In other words, the condemnation we always hear about, the church is full of condemnation. The condemnation is not designed to leave you wallowing in your condemnation. It's designed for you to be other than.
Yeah.
And we don't know always how to do that.
Yeah. Well, if there's anything we can grab from that, it's that the church, and I want to make sure I say this correctly, the church does not have the power to save or lose.
Right.
That is God. God forgives. And maybe one of the things the church can possibly do better on is learning to forgive others when there are failures, when there are faults. In fact, one of my favorite statements, and I'm going to mess this up in some ways, by Epictetus, ancient philosopher, who wrote that if someone were to come to you and tell you of your faults, you should kind of laugh and smile in essence and say, if they really knew me, they wouldn't say just these.
Right.
They would they would say far worse than these.
Right.
And there's an aspect where with the church where all of us, if somebody were to come up and say, well, I heard these things about you, our first response should be, oh man, if you really knew who I used to be, then absolutely all of these things and more. But that's not who I am anymore. It's not who I strive to be every day. I want to be different because I'm not the sinner I once was.
Right.
Instead, I've been redeemed, a sinner who has been bought and paid for by Jesus. And there is no condemnation in Christ.
Right. Romans 8:1,
and then that beautiful statement, the forgiveness, it's epic for us. And I'll tell you, in our world, if we could grasp that a little bit more, if we could share that, where people would walk in and instantly would go, it's okay. It's okay that you're not okay right now. It's not okay to stay that way,
Yeah.
but it's okay. This is a place where it's okay to say, I'm not okay. I need help. I need support.
Yeah.
And I'm so grateful for your time here, for sharing your story and the rest. In fact, as I mentioned, when I was thinking through who to bring in for these questions, when I saw these three, not only because of our conversations, but also because of not just your life, but because of how you have shown forgiveness to so many, how you've lived it, it was very easy for me to go, Jovan should answer that question.
I appreciate that.
And so I'm truly grateful for your presence. I'm so grateful for all of you that have been here live with us all these nights. Those of you who've been tuning in online, if you're watching live, thank you so much for being with us. If you are watching later on, also, thank you so much for being with us. We're so grateful that you had the opportunity to watch, to listen, to learn. Please let us know where you're coming from. Send us an email, a message, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, all of the above. We'd love to connect with you and support you and help you in any way that we can. With that in mind, and for Jovan, myself, Buckeyes for Christ, and the Church of Christ on Fishinger Road, we sign off tonight, wishing you the best, that you may have God's richest blessings, and that you will continue to seek His answers. Never be afraid of the questions that are being asked in our culture. Never be afraid to dive in and to look. The answers are there. God has provided and continues to provide. We wish you all the best, and we hope you have a wonderful night.